Genie Oil Investigation Part 7. I talked about how the CIA overthrew the government of Iran in 1953 during Operation Ajax to retake control of the Iranian oil for Western oil corporations. If you want to learn more about Operation Ajax, I recommend this book. Pretty good. It's All the Shah's Men by Stephen Kinzer. Well, the Rothschild and Rockefeller oil corporations continued to use the CIA and the Israeli Mossad to do this same kind of thing in other parts of the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Northeast and Central Africa. One of the huge oil grabs that very few Americans know about actually took place in the African nation of Sudan, which sits on the southern borders of Egypt and Libya. It's got Ethiopia to the east. This is the place in the Bible that was known as the Kingdom of Cush, no relation to the cannabis strain. Sudan was a huge territory, bigger than France, Germany, and the UK combined. The north half of Sudan consists primarily of Sudanese Arabs, so naturally the predominant religion is going to be Islam. Arabs make up about 70% of the total population. The southern half, though, consists primarily of black non-Muslims, with ethnic groups like the Nubians and the Copts. The name Sudan is actually Arabic, and it translates as the land of the black people. Another significant region, though, is Western Sudan with various ethnic groups, most notably the Darfur. You may have heard of them. This Western Sudanese region is roughly the size of Spain. Well, the CIA had backed a Sudanese military coup back in 1958. And for about 5 years, this new puppet government gave the CIA and various Western oil exploration teams open rein. But gradually, the government turned away from being pro-West, which of course meant that it was time to overthrow the government again to regain control. The oil corporations were searching for new resources to plunder, and they didn't need the Sudanese government hampering their search. It was believed that Sudan had a lot of oil. They just needed to find where it was located, and they needed to be able to get in and do that. So the Mossad sent in an Israeli asset named Joseph Lagu, who spearheaded a revolt against the government that turned into the first Sudanese civil war. He instigated this war using a Sudanese military colonel. His name was Jafar Nimeri. Nimeri was born in Egypt, but he actually spent a lot of time in the United States. In fact, he graduated from the U.S. Army Command in Kansas at Fort Leavenworth. This guy was a CIA agent, a CIA asset rather, plain and simple. He was with CIA. Well, the army that the CIA and the Mossad had built up around Nimeri was called Anya Nia, which translates as snake venom, which is pretty cool. It's kind of like the Cobra Army from G.I. Joe. Well, the funding for this army, for the weapons and everything, it came from the CIA, but to try to hide their involvement, Israel took care of delivering the weapons to Anya Nia. Actually, there was an Israeli military base in Uganda, which was just like 8 miles south of the border. And the CIA was so sneaky that they were actually sending in agents covertly to coordinate Anya Nia's activities by posing as members of the Peace Corps. Well, eventually, Nimeri comes to power, and this is in 1969, and he brought the first Sudanese civil war to a close in 1972 by declaring autonomy for the non-Muslims who lived down in that southern half down there. Sudan was basically divided in half, Muslims up in the north and the non-Muslims down in the south. Today, the people of South Sudan, they're about 60% Christian, about 32% of these various African religions, and only 8% Muslim. Anyway, as soon as he had finished getting this friction settled down, Nimeri did what he was installed to do in the first place, which was to open up Sudan for oil exploration. So he brought in Chevron, which was one of the oil giants that had been created after the United States Congress broke up Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly. Nimeri also opened the doors of Sudan to the Rothschild banking cartel. So this really ticks off the hardcore Muslims, both inside and outside of Sudan. In fact, in 1977, Muammar Gaddafi, who's never been a fan of the West, he trained a faction to actually go in and try and overthrow Nimeri, but the coup failed. Well, this tentative peace that Nimeri had established between the North and the South began to fail in the late 70s when Chevron discovered oil in the Darfur Kordofan region. And that's sandwiched kind of in between the North and the South regions. And they found even more oil deposits further south. So you've got the oil itself down in the south, but the port to get the oil out of the country to make the money, that's up in the north, in the Sudanese port up there. So naturally, you need to control both the south and the north if you're going to make money off of this oil. That's the reason, actually, why Britain had created Sudan as this country with these borders to begin with. They knew that the North and South were totally different groups of people, ethnically, culturally, religiously, but they wanted to ensure that they had control over the entire region in anticipation of being able to exploit potential oil resources. But anyway, history proves over and over and over that multiculturalism, it might sound nice, but it just doesn't work. You can't force the integration of different cultures together and expect it to work. Remember, the only way, going back to Nimeri, the only way that he had been able to end the First Sudanese Civil War was to grant the South its own partial autonomy anyway. But now, here he is regretting that decision, so Nimeri tried to take control of the oil fields for the North to put them, the oil up there, into the control of these Western oil corporations. The South, of course, says, heck no. To consolidate control over the oil, the CIA pushes Nimeri to form an alliance with the CIA Mossad-controlled Muslim Brotherhood, which he did. Nimeri went through this sudden change of heart. He became this hardcore, born-again Islamist. And he used the Sudanese intelligence service, the SSO, to crack down big time on dissidents. He became a violent dictator. He even started building a relationship with Gaddafi, the guy that tried to overthrow him before. The truth is, Nimeri was a blundering idiot. He was being pulled from so many sides he didn't know what to do. Well, skip forward a little bit to 1983. Finally, he decides to follow the counsel of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he tries to impose Sharia law on the non-Muslims down in the south. Now, this was all by design. The goal of the New World Order was to devastate this nation through conflict and chaos, so that the people of Sudan would be too weak to ever rise up against the oil corporations. They needed to wipe it all out. So while the CIA was helping Nimeri up in the north, Israel was helping to stir up opposition down in the south again. They helped the Sudanese military to desert down in the south, and they formed the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, under a guy named Colonel Garang, I think it was. Israel fed weapons and heavy artillery to this SPLA, but Nimeri and the SSO was getting considerable CIA support to fight back. So this second civil war was horrendous, and even the Sudanese in the north grew angry with Nimeri. So in 1985, while President Nimeri was visiting President Reagan in the United States, his own defense minister seized control of the government, ending Nimeri's dictatorship. But despite kicking out Nimeri, this second Sudanese civil war, it just continued to rage, which ended up bringing a halt to the nation's oil production. And things got worse when the Sudanese government decided to back Iraq during against Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War conflict. And in response to that, the Saudis pulled their money and all of their investments out of Sudan, which collapsed the Sudanese economy. And a famine ensued, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And the CIA orchestrated civil war, it just kept going. It ended up lasting 22 years. I'll tell you more about that later. Over 2 million civilians died during that conflict. It's the greatest civilian death toll since the World War II. And so you've got a mass slaughter going on with the CIA working on one side of the conflict and the Israeli Mossad on the other side. Very few Americans know anything about this conflict. That's because the same people who control the CIA and the Mossad are the same people who control our mainstream media. They don't want you to know what's going on around you, know what these guys are doing in the world. They certainly don't want you to know the truth about Osama bin Laden and what role he played for the CIA. Do you know what Osama was doing in Sudan after he moved there in 1991? I'm not mainstream media, so I'm going to tell you about it in my next video.